Greetings. In this video, I want to review some concepts that were discussed in video 4, as well as prepare you with some new concepts as you move into video 6. So in video 4, we look at the COVID situation, monetary policy during COVID. And then in the video 6, we look at monetary policy after COVID and up to the present. And I just want to review some of these principles with you just to solidify some of the concepts before you move into another application. The next video was rather rigorous, and I just want to be sure that you've got some of these basic concepts down. So let's just very quickly run through this. I've written most of this out, so I'm not going to improvise much here. I just want to go through these concepts with you and check these off. So first of all, we're talking about an ample reserve framework. So this is a system, in number 1 here, this is going to be a system where reserves are ample. And how do we know reserves are ample? The demand curve for reserves in the federal funds market, which is the downward sloping function, equals the supply curve of reserves at a federal funds rate of 0%. So we know that we have ample reserves when the supply curve hits the demand curve at that horizontal portion on the demand curve. So that's point 1. And I'm going to show you a picture down here below, and you'll be able to see this as we move into this. And then in point 2, in the ample reserves framework, open market operations cannot alter the federal funds rate. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that because the supply curve is intersecting with the demand curve on the horizontal section of the demand curve, the open market operations in moving the supply curve cannot alter the rate at 0. So let me read this. In the ample reserves framework, open market operations cannot alter the federal funds rate. Why? Because the supply of reserves is moving along a horizontal demand curve for federal funds reserves at a rate of 0. All right, so movements, open market operations, when the Fed buys bonds, that shifts the supply curve to the right. But if the demand curve is flat, no change in interest rate. And then selling off bonds, if the Fed were to sell off bonds, that would shift that supply curve for reserves to the left. But again, we're on a horizontal demand curve, and you can't move the federal funds market. Okay, so that's a key idea in an ample reserves framework. Now, here's a picture. This is a review. You've seen the picture in 2009 already. In fact, you just looked at it. And this shows us what we're talking about. The supply curve is intersecting the demand curve here, and this is on the horizontal portion of this demand curve. So this demand curve is horizontal here. Notice that the federal funds rate in 2009 is 0%, and this is what we mean by zero, I'll just write it out, zero interest rate policy. So the Fed did this on purpose. The Fed's goal was to push the federal funds rate right down to 0. And how did it do that? It flooded the banking system with reserves. The problem now is, though, that the Fed now has lost a tool. Open market operations cannot be used, at least it hasn't lost the tool, but it's one of the purposes of the tool to alter the federal funds rate. That tool no longer works for that. So open market operations are designed to move this curve, either to move it to the right when the Fed buys bonds, or to move it to the left when the Fed sells bonds. But if you're on the horizontal portion of this demand curve, you're not affecting the federal funds rate at all. Okay, so you'll need another tool to move the federal funds rate. Okay, let's keep going here. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just want to review these concepts with you. And of course, you can always go back and look at them. The quantity of reserves demanded equals 0 at the discount rate level. Okay, this is very important. Notice that in all of these models, the demand curve, the quantity of reserves demanded will equal 0. And where will that happen? At the discount rate. So notice, again, that point right there, it's a point on this demand curve. And at 0.5%, which is the discount rate, the amount of reserves demanded are zero. Now that's very interesting, and I've got a note here to explain it, so let's go through it. The quantity of reserves demanded equals zero at the discount rate level. We just showed that on the graph, in this case 0.5%. Why? If the federal fund rate were greater than the discount rate, then borrowing banks would borrow from the Fed's discount window. In other words, they would go to the discount window to get the funds they want, and they would not go to other banks in the federal funds market. So if the federal funds rate were to ever get above the discount rate, not going to happen because the Fed isn't going to let it happen, but if the federal funds rate were up here, nobody would want to borrow in the federal funds market. They would want to borrow at the discount window. So in other words, there would be no demand for funds in the federal funds market. Okay, so that's an important principle. You want to take a look at that. Okay, again, let me read it. The quantity of reserves demanded equals zero at the discount rate level. Why? If the federal funds rate were greater than the discount rate, then borrowing banks would borrow from the Fed's discount window and not borrow from other banks at a rate higher than the discount rate. The Fed doesn't let the discount rate fall below the federal funds rate. So you'll always see the discount rate higher than the federal funds rate, and I just gave you the reason for that. So we can also conclude, based on that the discount rate sets an upper boundary on the federal funds rate, that the federal funds rate will never be higher than the discount rate. Now I show you a picture of 2023, and you're going to be working on this in the next video. But I just want to explain a few things to you before you move into that. First of all, you notice that the federal funds rate was way down here at zero, but now it is increased way up here to 4.9% by 2023. You may wonder, how did it increase? Well, it didn't increase by movements in this supply curve. This supply curve actually moved dramatically. If you look at the supply in 2009, this supply curve is way over here, okay? Way over here. Actually, I would put it in 2009, it's way over here. So in 2009, the supply curve is way back here. We're already on the flat portion, but look, between 2009 and 2013, the Fed has continued to push this supply curve to the right, and we'll talk about why they did that. But it's certainly not to affect the federal funds rate. That would have no effect on the federal funds rate when the federal funds rate were zero. So how did the Fed raise the federal funds rate? Well, it has begun to pay it has begun to pay interest on reserves. And this is called the interest on reserves rate. And so it says here in number 5, the interest on reserves rate is set by the Fed. It steers the federal funds rate in a world of ample reserves. See the 2023 model above, which is what we're doing. If the federal funds rate is greater than, if the interest rate on reserves is greater than the federal funds rate, and this is the condition, reserves move from the federal funds market to the IOR rate and to these IOR accounts with the Fed. The supply of reserves in the federal fund market decrease, causing the federal funds rate to increase till it equals the IOR rate. All right, so let's talk about that. Let me actually explain this on the picture up here. So what the Fed began to do is, first of all, it began to pay interest on any reserves that were being held with the Fed. So the Fed began to raise this interest on reserves rate above the federal fund rate, which was at zero. As it did that, funds began to move out of the federal funds market into these accounts because the IOR was higher than the federal funds rate, and banks are seeking the highest interest rate they can get on their reserves. So I'm going to put it in an account with the Fed rather than leave it in the federal funds market where I'm going to earn less. So if the IOR is greater than the federal funds rate, which is exactly what had to happen to pull the federal funds rate up here, then what's going to happen? Funds are going to move out of the federal funds market into these accounts. And when these funds move out of the federal funds market, guess what will happen? The decrease in the supply of federal funds will actually raise the interest rate. And you know what's going to happen here? The federal funds rate is going to track that IOR until they're equal. Okay? So let's read it again and make sure we understand it. If the IOR rate is greater than the federal funds rate, so let's say this is 2% when this is 0%, where would banks with reserves want to put their reserves? They'd want to put it in these accounts with the Fed. So if the IOR rate is greater than the federal funds rate, reserves move from the federal funds market to these IOR accounts with the Fed. The supply of reserves, now this is the key idea, the supply of reserves in the federal funds market decreases. So there aren't as many funds in the federal funds market because these funds are being parked in these accounts with the Fed. What's that going to do? That's going to cause the federal fund rate to increase. And it'll keep increasing until it equals the IOR rate. Okay, so what ends up happening is the FFR, the federal funds rate, will equilibrate with the IOR rate wherever it is. And of course, this works in reverse. Now, this is not really what happened between 2009, where the FFR was equal to 0%. You know, we're talking about how did it get from there all the way up to here. Okay, and I just described that. What the Fed began to do is, first of all, it began to pay on these reserves, and then it began to raise that rate. And as it raised that interest rate on reserves, guess what happened? The federal funds rate tracked it up because funds were moving out of the federal funds market into these accounts, pushing the federal funds rate up. Okay, so that's how that works. Kind of interesting. If the Fed ever wants to lower the federal funds rate, let's say below that 4.9%, then what's it got to do? It's going to what? It's going to lower the IOR rate below the federal funds rate. What happens? Reserves are going to move out of these accounts. Why? Because banks can make more by loaning these reserves to other banks, not parking them in the Federal Reserve. So funds will move from these IOR accounts with the Fed into the federal funds market. So in other words, banks will choose to loan to other banks rather than park these funds in the Federal Reserve at some interest rate. The supply of reserves in the federal funds market will what? Increase, causing what? The federal funds rate to decrease till it equals, this will happen until it equals or equilibrates with the IOR rate. Okay? So again, you know, this is a video, so you can go back and watch it. You can reread this several times. But I just wanted to point out to you that, you know, in an ample reserves framework where we can no longer use open market operations to move the federal funds rate, the only way to move the federal funds rate is with this interest rate on reserves rate, because this ends up becoming an administrative rate that the Fed can move and change the incentives to hold funds either in the federal funds market or to pull funds out of the federal funds market. Okay? So I strongly encourage you to review this before you go to the next video, video 6. This is video 5. This is the model you're going to see in video 6, and I'm going to be doing some more explaining here, and I'll be reviewing some of the same concepts again. I mean, suppose we look at another model in the year 2025, and we see that the Fed has wanted to lower the federal funds rate back down. So it's moved, by 2023, it's moved the federal funds rate up to about 5. But what if by 2025, it wants to move the federal funds rate back down again? Well, it's going to follow that process we just described. Okay, so the Fed can move this federal funds rate by moving the IOR and changing the incentives between for banks. Either do we park our funds in a reserve account with the Fed and earn the interest on reserves, or do we take those reserves and loan them in the federal funds market? That becomes the choice, and that IOR rate is going to influence that choice. Okay, we'll leave it there. Again, I thank you for taking the time to look at these videos. It's clear that you want to learn this material because you've come here to learn it. If you're confused, watch it again. And also some of this is explained, in fact, it's all explained in your e-workbook. I wish you the best.